All right. Before I begin my lecture for today, I just want to make a couple of announcements. The first is that this room is actually a little bit small for the number of students who are enrolled in the class. There are more students enrolled than the number of seats available in the room. So I'm going to request all of you that when you come in, try to take up the seats in the front because there'll be people who will be coming in late, and then it's going to disturb everybody if they're going to come, into the front where there are vacant seats. So if you can, just try to be accommodating to everybody and try to move up front rather than taking up the seats at the back. Secondly, I want to reinforce the idea that I mentioned to you before, that the video streaming is not really meant to be a substitute for coming to class, and you'll see why today, because today we're going to engage partly in a kind of a Socratic exercise where I'm going to ask you some questions and I'm going to ask you to respond, and we're going to have a discussion. And this sort of thing is not really going to be captured in the video streaming or on the podcast. So, what you should really be using that for is if you miss a class or if there are things that you don't understand in class, or I'm going a little too fast, which is going to happen on occasion, then what you do is you go to the audio podcast or the video streaming, and obviously review it once again in order to be able to familiarize yourself with the material. All right. Does anybody have any? Has anybody encountered any problems with the readings? Or is there anybody who's not able to access the readings for any reason? And if you have any problem, just ask one of your fellow students or come to me, and we'll see if we can resolve the situation. Yeah.
I asked some people earlier, but as far as readings go, should we try to finish them on Tuesday before?
You should, if possible. If possible. I mean, there'll be occasions when you can't do it. I wouldn't fret over it if you can't do it. And generally what will happen is we'll be running behind a little bit. So, for example, we are behind a little bit right now, but that's not at all a problem because the way the syllabus has been structured, there are portions in the middle of the course where I've actually allotted more time than we need for that particular subject, precisely because there'll be occasions when we have fallen behind a little bit. But what you should try to do is do the reading for the entire week, if possible, by the Tuesday of that week. Okay? That's where I think it will be most productive for you when you come to class. All right, there are seats in the front, so just don't hesitate, just come in. And you can see why I said that it'll be best if you take up the seats in the front before you take up the seats in the back. Okay? All right, so what I'm going to do today is principally the following. We're going to have a discussion about Orientalism, of course, quite a lengthy discussion, and I'm going to look at a few passages as well, so we're going to discuss it in detail, because this is the foundation for trying to understand what are some of the problems in interpreting the history of British India, in interpreting, in fact, any history, particularly of the Orient, whatever that term means. It's a quaint term today, frankly, right, because it encompasses, obviously, if you look at Edward Said's book Orientalism, from which you're reading the first 27, 28 pages, he talks about mainly the Middle East in this book. Those are the primary examples, although he has in mind as well India and China and other parts of the world, not just the Orient. So in fact, the whole theory of Orientalism, as it's been used and as it's been discussed, in fact is used to describe a good deal of the Western discourse about Africa, for example, right? So we don't want to be thinking just about something called the Orient, and some of you might be thinking of China or Japan or Southeast Asia or India. What we're really thinking about is, in this case, how the West interpreted, right, other civilizations that it encountered. And in this case, what we are interested in is obviously India. And that's where the second piece by Ronald comes in, which I had made a little notation on the syllabus that if you don't follow all of it, don't worry about it, because I'm here to try to help you. There might be parts of it that are opaque to me, in fact, actually, but certainly going to try to help you understand exactly what the nature of his arguments are. So we're going to discuss Orientalism, and if we have time, we will consider the circumstances under which the British came to India. And obviously the next lecture will lead into that and into what you might describe as, quote, history proper, although I'm going to suggest some caveats about that as well. But what I want to begin with is to ask you a question and see what, assuming that most of you know nothing about the history of British India, except the bare bones fact that the British, as I said, arrived in India, and I mentioned that in my introductory lecture, in the early 1600s. Right? So there was a charter that was given to the East India Company by Queen Elizabeth, and then a number of men decided that they were going to start trading with India. So this charter is to create a company called the East India Company. There are stocks in the company, obviously. And 1601 and thereafter, the first voyages to India will begin. Right? And British rule terminates in 1947. Terminates, at least in a certain sense of the term. That is, that India becomes a sovereign country at that point. Right? So that's a period of 350 years. So my question to you is this. What do you suppose is it that made it possible for the British to rule India so long? Now, they didn't rule India in the 1600s, right? But the actual period of governance, you could say, is 200 years, roughly. Right? The official conquest of India is thought to begin in 1757, and there's going to be gradual expansion. And when we speak of the conquest of India by the British in 1757, we're not saying that the British were able to attain hegemony over all of India. Right? This is the conquest of Bengal in 1757, and then gradually over the course of the next 100 years, the British are going to slowly be able to consolidate their rule over the rest of India. And we could say that, in fact, by the early 1800s, British dominion over India is fully established. Right? That significant chunks of the country have fallen under their rule, and we can speak of an entity called British India at that point in time. So even if we take 1757, that's still 200 years. Right? How do you suppose that the British were able to govern India for 200 years? Let's look at a very contemporary example. Right, and we're not saying that this is a perfect analogy. By no stretch of the imagination am I offering it as a perfect analogy. But let's say if you look at, and we're not saying that the Americans have gone to Afghanistan to conquer Afghanistan, or that they waged a war in Iraq to conquer Iraq. The argument might be that, well, we went to Iraq in order to overthrow a dictator, because there's a humanitarian responsibility that we have as a world power to ensure that people are not oppressed by their own rulers. Right? That's the argument that is given. So we've gone there to not only overthrow the dictator, but to do what? To lay the seeds for democracy. Right? You would agree, right, that was the argument. I'm not saying whether it has any resemblance to reality at all. Let's not worry about that at the moment. That is the argument furnished by the American administration, right? And you could say that in some ways it's tantamount to conquest. But you go there to establish the seeds of democracy, well, how long are you going to stay there? Right? So if you look at the British arguments for being in India, my question to you, and I really want you to engage it, don't worry if you think you don't have the right answer, but just make a stab at it. What is it that made it possible for the British to stay on in India for 200 years? Imagine how difficult it is for the Americans to stay on in Afghanistan for a decade. A decade. Now we're talking about 200 years. Yes?
They got the Indians to give them their consent.
How did they? Okay, but that begs the question. Why did the Indians give their consent?
Because they created a knowledge, or so-called common knowledge, and then it was expanded within the academia and writers and artists, and then within there people accepted it. They internalized being what was Said says. I remember him saying backwards.
Yeah.
So I think the people internalize it, and then in Gramsci's sense of consent, it was subtle.
Okay, so Indians largely accepted the view that the British had put forward, that they're a backward people in need of Christian civilization.
Yes.
You think that the bulk of Indians actually accepted that view? I mean, that apart from the educated elite, such as they might have been, do you think that most of the people in this vast terrain actually accepted the view that, well, the British are claiming to bring a superior civilization to us, and we accept that, and so therefore we'll accept British rule. Okay, so, all right, yeah?
I feel like maybe sort of not so much that. There's definitely a component of that, but that the British continued a lot of policies started by people like the Mughals, where they didn't change necessarily, didn't try to convert people or change their religion, but sort of let them stay as they were as long as they followed certain guidelines of the British Empire.
Okay, but wouldn't that suggest to you, let's take your argument really seriously and push it a bit. You're saying that in India, at least, people really didn't care who they were governed by, so long as the new set of rulers who replaced the Mughals, in this case the British, so long as they more or less guaranteed some kind of semblance of law and order. So long as most Indians thought that, well, we can continue to do what we have always done, it really doesn't matter who rules us. Right. Now, would you say that that is quite characteristic of people all over the world? I mean, doesn't it? Let's supposing that tomorrow the Indians came into the U.S. in droves, okay, over a period of 2 decades, and gradually what you find is that all the top layers of administration are taken over by Indians. Would you say that most Americans would say that, well, frankly, we don't really care who we're governed by any longer, right? So long as I can continue to go to Burger King, or so long as I can continue to be a stockbroker at Wall Street, frankly, I don't really care who governs me. Would you say that most Americans would be
I don't know.
amenable or agreeable to that idea? I don't think so. I don't think so. Yes. Yeah.
I don't know if this might be a shot in the dark, but it would be the manipulation of their resources, the sort of dominance over...
Manipulation over their resources. I think I have a vague idea what you mean, but I would like you to elaborate on that if you can. You mean natural resources, cultural resources, that... Because remember what the question is. The question is that India was under colonial rule for at least 200 years. We're taking 1757 as a formal date. It's very clear that there are parts of India where the British have established their dominion even before that. But let's take that date, 200 years, right? So the question is, so you're saying that the reason why the British were able to stay on so long is they were able to manipulate the resources, right? But then, of course, that again begs the question, why were they able to manipulate the resources? I mean, would most countries in the North, in the industrialized North today that we call it, would they be agreeable or acceptable to having people coming from elsewhere manipulating their resources? No. So then is there some intrinsic difference? Right? I'll get to all of you in just a moment. Yeah, is there some intrinsic difference then between the character of the Americans and the character of the Indians? Does it come down to that, for example, right? Some people may well argue, I mean, and that is partly what Orientalism is going to be about, that there are intrinsic differences between the civilization of what we might call the West, very broadly. I'm saying the West rather than Europe, because now I'm obviously including, offshoots of European civilization, including the United States, Canada, Australia, so forth and so on. Right? That there's some intrinsic difference. Now, if there is, then we've got a problem, because then we'll have to contend with a different Enlightenment idea that is vastly prevalent in Europe, namely that human nature and human knowledge is unitary. That fundamentally, human beings share certain characteristics. That we cannot say that the proclivity for truth is greater in this civilization than in others. That Americans or French appreciate beauty more than do the Indians and the Chinese and the Africans, and so forth and so on. Right? That's when we get to these so-called essential differences. Right? Because it was a cardinal aspect of European thought to argue, for example, that the Indian gives no credence to the idea of truth. But Indians always lie. I will give you a very dramatic illustration of a case, and then I'll get to the rest of you, because I want to finish my train of thought here. In the late 1800s, I wrote a very long article on it, so you can find it on Manas. In the late 1800s, 1890s and so on, there are two court cases that come up in British India. I'm not going to tell you the cases at any length. What I want to do is just give you the bare facts. The bare facts are, in both of these cases, a father is convicted on the basis of testimony given by the father's own minor child. In one case, a son who's 6 years old. In another case, a daughter who's 7 years old. Imagine that you are convicted, okay, of murder on the basis of testimony given by your own child who's 6 years old and 7 years old. Now in England this could never happen. Why could it not happen? Because the testimony of a 6-year-old would not count. It would not be considered acceptable. One of the reasons it would not be considered acceptable is because you can tutor a child. You know, if you say something to a child who's that young, often enough, they'll get to believe it. Okay? That the children can be easily manipulated because the faculty of reason is not fully developed. So in England, you could not convict a person, okay, on the basis of a testimony given by a 6-year-old or a 7-year-old. In India, you could. Why? And when we say India, we're talking about British India at this time. Why could you do that in India? You could do that in India because the British theory was, in India, adults always lie. Only children do not lie. Because children are innocent. Children are innocent. That's a very bizarre way of thinking about the world. So this relies upon this whole romantic theory that you find in Wordsworth and poets like that, that the soul of a child is really innocent. You know, and we all tend to think of children as pure, uncontaminated, right, innocent, etc., etc. So the argument here is that, hey, the problem in India is that you get a witness to come into court, almost every witness will lie, because they've either been bribed, or they've been manipulated, or they've been coerced, or they've been threatened. The Indian simply does not have a disposition towards telling the truth, because this particular disposition is a more characteristic feature of the West, where such virtues have been more highly developed, according to this strand of thought. So in India, ironically, only a child can be relied upon to give accurate testimony. It's extraordinary if you think about it. I mean, if you have a criminal justice system based on a concept like this, it's, I would say, absolutely extraordinary. All right? So when the question now is, what is it that you think? Assuming that you know very little about the history of British India, and we might not really know the answer, because this might be one question where we might say that, well, there have been historians who've been tackling this for 30 years and can't really figure out exactly what is it that permitted the British to be able to rule India for so long. You know. Okay. Yeah.
Well, what I was thinking was that obviously there are going to be, as far as the research, there will be more Indians versus British in India. That's pretty fair. So if the British are there, obviously they'll probably need the Indian people for manpower. So I'm thinking that they would probably threaten them, also belittle them, and maybe manipulation. I feel like that's going a little too far, because Indian people can obviously think for themselves because they're human beings as well.
Yes.
But so I'm thinking,
good to know that.
Honestly, I'm thinking that it was probably just they were just threatening them, because I'm not really sure as far as how the military was in India, or how their advancement in weapons was, but I know at that time that the British were the biggest world power. So
they were, but the number of Britishers in India was
I know,
very...
but they have guns and all that.
No. This, you know, look, this is not, you see, this is not quite, I mean, let me use the cliche here, this is not quite the Wild West of America, okay? I mean, it's not as though you've got machine guns against the arrows, bows and arrows of, okay, Native Americans.
Yeah, no, I'm not.
All right, you know, if you read John Ellis, Fantastic book he wrote. I'm going to drop these, by the way, these recommendations, and if you're ever interested, you take them up. Many of them will have nothing to do with India. I mean, he wrote this book. It's called The Social History of the Machine Gun. Okay? Now, what happened when the machine gun, right, comes into place? So if you look at these battles that were fought, so-called battles that were fought in Africa, okay, between colonial armies and Zulu warriors, let's say, for every 1,000 Zulus that were killed, one Britisher would be killed. You position the machine gun on top of a hill, right? And these guys are spears, and you just completely mow them down. Because what's happened is that there's a disproportionate advantage, right, that one side has. That was never the case in India. It was never the case in India. I mean, there might have been some differences in military technology. In fact, it is widely understood that the military technology that some Indian rulers had was superior to the military technology that very often that the British had. When we go into the 18th century, into the second half of the 18th century, looking at rulers such as Tipu Sultan, we're going to find that his armies are actually being trained by the French. Right? They're French military advisors that he has, and so fairly quote scientific and modern. Okay, right? So I'm not so sure about that. Yes.
The way I kind of see it, if you're going to subjugate a body of people that large,
yeah,
you can't go in with guns blazing. It has to the people, they have to see some kind of mutual beneficial thing.
Okay.
And especially since the first thing that they established in India was the trading company.
Yeah.
I think it probably started more as an economic relationship. They probably saw more symbiotic. And over time, you're going to be exerting more soft power into the relationship. You're going to be gaining a greater foothold. Yeah. Until next thing you know, this group of people is completely taken over.
I was waiting for someone to use the phrase soft power, right? Because that's one of the ways in which it's very often described. Of course, we're going to have to now figure out what was the nature of that so-called soft power that the colonial state exercised in a place like India. So when you say that, well, some people had to see it, at least some people in India had to see this as mutually beneficial, right? I think that there's some merit to that, certainly. We can use a more dirty word, if you like, collaborationists, that no such rule can survive without there being a large number of collaborationists, right? That would be another way to look at it, right? But let's try to see if we can give a bit more of an ideological argument. In other words, let me prompt you all. For example, if you look at the case of the Americans, what are some of the largest, what are 2 or 3 of the most prominent justifications that have been given, right, for the war on Afghanistan? What would you say? Can you think of something that immediately comes to mind?
Fight terrorism?
Yeah?
American safety abroad.
American?
American safety abroad.
American, so national interest, right? Yeah, but that's, is there some, let me rephrase the question. Is there some particular shortcoming in those societies which is always mentioned as a justification for the Americans being present in Afghanistan? Yes?
Religious conflict?
Sorry?
Religious conflict?
Religious conflict between whom? Now, if you're going to give, if you say religious conflict, who's a religious conflict? The Americans are not saying, by the way, that they went into Afghanistan because there's real religious conflict in Afghanistan and they're going to try to sort out that mess. No, that's not really. I mean, because if you say religious conflict, then it would mean it's a predominantly Muslim country, right? So it would be conflict between different ethnic groups, for example, the Pathans versus the other groups, let's say, or the Shias versus the Sunnis. But no, there's some other story. Somebody who's, yeah, Sunny, yeah.
Democracy and freedom.
Democracy and freedom. Yeah, okay, so, but that's, let's get concrete. I mean, democracy and freedom, every place the Americans go, they say they want to bring democracy and freedom. Organized systems of governing. Organized, you'll have to spell it out, because that's the same as democracy, essentially, if you know what I mean. That they're going to bring certain kinds of democratic institutions, to a people who do not have these systems of governance, right? I want to ask some people who haven't raised their hands yet. Yes.
It's the American ideal of justice, bringing this idea of bringing justice to them.
Yeah.
It kind of goes off of this idea of freedom and democracy, but more so it undertails the idea that we need to go in there to bring them to, I guess, for lack of better terms, to our level.
Right, but that's a variation of the democracy, freedom, liberty. These abstractions that always sound very nice. Yes.
I always hear them talk about the safety and the trust that the people have in the government in relations to, that they want to go in there to make sure that we feel safe and make sure that they still stand, in power and not affected by anything that they brought to us.
Okay. Yes.
A hegemon as the greatest power we feel responsible to go in. The same thing happened with Britain. Britain was the hegemon when they went to India.
Right. But the question is this. Okay, let's go back. Think about what I'm trying to say. This is what I mean by the Socratic exercise. We're just going to continue this until you understand exactly what it is that we are searching for. The question that we began with was, what is it that enabled the British to rule India for 200 years or more? All right? And so I said, all right, now by way of, let's take a modern day example, because you know a bit more about that than you do about British India. Right? What are the justifications furnished by the Americans for the war on Afghanistan? So forget about 9/11. Yes, that's always there. We know that. Okay? 9/11, the Taliban were there. We want to root them out, smoke them out, whatever your favorite metaphor is. Okay? For those of you who are development majors, you do global studies, there is something called the UNDP, United Nations Development Program, and they bring out a human index, right? You rank countries. Which is the most developed country in the world? Which is the second, third? And then you go all the way down. What is it about Afghanistan society that the Americans say they found repellent and we're going to do something about it? Yes?
Uncivilized.
Yes, but you see, again, that's too broad. I mean, from the American standpoint, there are lots of places that are uncivilized, frankly. Yes?
Literacy, immortality rate, women's rights.
Women's rights. That's what I wanted to hear. If you look at American reports, they'll tell you that one of the biggest justifications for going into Afghanistan is the fact that in Afghanistan, women have no rights. You remember the case of that, the young woman who's become a world hero now, right? Because she was shot in the head and she survived that attack, right? Which is only a few months ago. Exactly. Yeah. Right? Why does this story become such a big story? Because the idea here is that, hey, in places like Pakistan and Afghanistan, women are not treated properly. This is a very old colonial argument. What I'm trying to suggest to you is the following, that if you look at British rule in India, and this is the case with what the Americans are doing in Afghanistan. If you look at British rule in India, it's very clear that by the early 19th century, the British had come around to the view that one of the best justifications they could offer to themselves and to the Indians for why they were necessary, why it was necessary for them to be in India, one of the best justifications was that we will, in fact, help to improve the condition of women. Now, you might say, well, why is that so important? Isn't it and somebody might say, well, it's self-explanatory why it's important. After all, they constitute 50% of the race. Well, in fact, it's not self-evident, because clearly in all cultures and civilizations, there have been a huge number of people, not just women, who've been oppressed. For example, African-American men. Right? Let's assume that women have been put down in most societies. But there are clearly other constituencies as well which have been put down, either on grounds of their religion or their ethnicity, right? Or their beliefs. So the argument that is going to develop, and we're going to revisit this argument later on, the argument that's going to develop in the early 19th century is the following, that essentially we develop an evaluative scale where we place one civilization in relation to another and we judge them. So, for example, one of the ways in which you evaluate civilizations, or nation states today rather, is you say, and that's what the UNDP report does. What is the percentage of literacy in a country? What is the number of doctors per 100,000 people? What is the number of hospital beds per 100,000 people? What percentage of the population has access to drinking water, potable drinking water? What percentage of the population has access to electricity, etc., etc.? One of the largest indices of this kind is what are the rights available to women. In the 19th century, in early 19th century in British India, this is going to become a critical argument because, and this is the philosophical, ideological component of that argument, you judge a civilization and judge how advanced it is according to how it treats its women. Okay? So this is one reason why, for example, if you look at State Department reports, official reports on Afghanistan, the argument will always be furnished that one of the principal reasons why we as Americans had to move into Afghanistan is that we have to liberate their women. And remember what's happening. You're liberating brown women from brown men. And you need white men to do that. That's what I want you to remember. You're liberating brown women from the clutches of brown men. And the way you do it is you bring white men into the picture. Right? This is exactly what's happening in Afghanistan today. In many ways mirrors the kind of arguments that you're going to find in early 19th century India. Now, I'm not going to be able to take any more answers for the moment because I want to just continue with my train of thought here. Right? So we started with that because this is one way to get into the subject of Orientalism. So one of the many justifications given, for example, for British rule in India was, nobody really mentioned this in those terms, is that they were going to bring law and order to a country where there was anarchy. That's their view. Okay? They're going to bring law and order. In fact, Henry Sumner Maine, who is a member of the Council of the Viceroy, in the 1860s, he's what's called the law member. So the law member means the equivalent of the Secretary of State for law, let's say, today. Okay, if there was such a position. Right? The law member, Henry Sumner Maine, in the 1860s says that India is a country that is bereft, i.e. empty of law. There's no law in India. It's just sheer chaos. And one reason why we're here is to bring law and order, because people everywhere appreciate law and order, because those are the conditions under which you can raise a family, do your job, right? Create a civil society. And of course, then you have to ask, well, how did India survive for 4,000 years if there was no law and order? What was the nature of that society? I mean, after all, there's been a civilization there for millennia before the British actually came along. Right? So what was the nature of that argument that we are going to furnish law and order to India? Right? And this question, the answer that was mentioned here at the outset, the idea of consent is important. What we have to understand is how were the British able to gain the consent of Indians? Right? This is going to be an endeavor that we're going to be interested in for a period of time. Now, let me formally, with those remarks, move into the question of Orientalism, as Edward Said has described it. So what is Orientalism? Yes?
The romantic part of Orientalism, which would kind of go a little bit opposite to what you just said. Not everybody thought that the Indian society was this lowly thing, but there would be other people who thought if the East, whatever that is much better and higher and more developed spiritually than the West, and so they would uphold that sort of Vedic tradition or whatever they would grasp onto the religious. So then there's those people, and that fits within Orientalism.
You're right, but you've gone way ahead, because that's the difference between what we might describe as the positivist conception versus the romantic conception of Orientalism. But that's way ahead. First, let's think of what exactly is Orientalism. Yes?
I was thinking of how West civilizations viewed Eastern civilizations
without actually going to the East.
And
So do you think going to the East makes a difference? I mean, does that make you better equipped to study a place necessarily?
I'm a bit, hold on. Let me start over. I had a brain fart. Okay. So in the article, Edward Said says that, like, from what I remember in taking art history classes and reading this article from before, is that pretty much like a bunch of artists ended up representing this type of Orientalism, and it was just from word of mouth. Basically, these artists never have gone to the Middle East whatsoever. They're just creating these paintings based on stories that other people have told them. Basically, how the women looked, how the men looked, what the religion was like, the architecture, everything. And it's just, as she was saying, it's just a romantic interpretation as well as completely racist as
Yes.
well. Yeah, it's pretty much it.
Okay, but do you think that Western civilization has a monopoly on that? I mean, don't people elsewhere in the world? I mean, for example, I won't give you concrete examples, but I know in my conversations with middle-class Indians over the last 40 years, if my memory goes back to at least 40 years about this sort of thing, that Indians have all kinds of conceptions about African Americans, for example.
Well, yeah, of course. But
Right?
I was
And
thinking-
they have certain conceptions about the Chinese, and the Chinese have certain views about Indians, right? So what's the exact nature of something called Orientalism?
The Orientalism is a discourse that is created by those in power. In this case, it would be the Occident or the West.
Okay.
And it's put on the people that cannot necessarily be as, they can't represent themselves because they don't have as much power as the people trying to take over the space. That you
Okay, so it's a discourse created by people who have power,
Correct, yes.
right? All right, so I accept what you're saying. We want to see if we can sharpen it a bit, okay? We want to see if we can sharpen it a bit. So would you agree with me that historically, in most societies in the world, men have exercised power over women? Would you agree with me? You would, right? So then would you say that most men's narratives about women are all, quote, Orientalist? I'm just going by the definition that you sort of mentioned, right? That Orientalism is a discourse of power. So, and incidentally, in a certain way, we're just trying to sharpen it. In a certain way, I have power over you,
Yes, you do.
right? I mean, there's a hierarchical relationship between students and faculty.
Yeah.
Now, there may be limits to that hierarchical relationship, but it's a hierarchical relationship, right? So, clearly, we would not use the word Orientalist, however, to describe my relationship to you, all. No, I think you would agree, even though it's a relationship of power to some degree, right? So, that's what I mean. Let's sharpen it a bit more, okay? And I want to also bring into play a word that was used, representation, right? How would you bring it further into play, right? Somebody else had their hand up. They wanted to, yes.
Almost like it's a lens or something through which the West perceives the
Yeah.
Orient, and kind of like it has less to do with the Orient itself as it has to do with how the West perceives it.
Okay, it has less to do with the Orient itself than with how the West perceives it. So, good, I agree. Here's the question that follows then. And that question is there a real Orient other than the Orient that is described in these texts? I mean, do you think that that's what Said is saying? That, look, these texts, and what are these texts? It could be any number of things. It could be grammars, dictionaries, travel narratives. You know, a British council officer in Cairo in 1800 writing a report back saying, hey, I think Egyptians are, lazy, deceitful. Islam is a fanatical religion, blah, 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 right? That's what he's writing in 1800, right? And you could say that that's an example of an Orientalist text. Okay, but it could be a travel narrative, it could be fiction. It could be fiction. The way you draw up your character, essentially you make the characters stand for certain things. Films today. All of that. So clearly the range that he is talking about, Edward Said, is vast, right? And all of these things together create a certain kind of discourse. They create a certain kind of discourse, right? Now, in order to sharpen this, we have to ask a number of questions. The first question is, what do we mean when we say representation? Who represents whom? Yes?
So sort of this ethnocentric, hubris on the part of the West to say we know the depth of what they are. We can capture their essence by putting this out there instead of...
Okay. We can capture their essence, and can you explain a bit more what you understand by essence? I agree with you, but I want to know what that means.
What their human nature means to them, as is defined by how they live and speak and trade and read and do all of these things, whereas the West represents what they think is a reality of the East in relation to how the West would either do it or not do it.
All right.
People would appreciate it or would think about it.
Okay.
Sort of like only by default, like only in relation to the West, not as it stands alone.
Okay. So would you then agree with the proposition that Orientalist discourse tells you perhaps something or nothing even about the Orient, but it tells you something definitely about the persons who created that discourse?
Like a bully, it means less about the person who's being picked on than...
Yeah.
I'm not saying the West is a total bully, but it's that saying that the focus needs to shift from what they're talking about to who's doing
Yeah, it might not have to be a bully at all. I mean, this is where soft power comes in. We'll have to be very careful with that, because and that's why in my first class I just gave you that brute fact that there were never more than 100,000 Britishers in India. Okay. And sure, they're backed up by an army and so forth and so on, but the army, by the way, is staffed almost by Indians. I mean, except for the officers who were Britishers, and of course they made sure that the artillery was never in the hands of Indians, because that's fatal. You don't want artillery in the hands of Indians. I mean, you'll get shelled to extinction, conceivably, right? What's very clear is that clearly, the notion of the bully, for example, here, is not really critical, right, for understanding what it is that we're talking about when we speak of something called, Orientalism, right? There was a hand at the back. Yeah.
I was just going to say, in terms of representation, I think that in relation to Orientalism, the East is not actually representing themselves. It's the West that's basically judging the East based off of their own observations, which is oftentimes incorrect or false.
Yeah.
Like on their culture and like social dynamics.
Okay. I agree with that. Essentially the East is being represented by the West, and some of these representations may not be, accurate and so on, right? But let me tell you what the difficulty is if you put it in that fashion. The difficulty, if you put it in that fashion, is that the West will argue that an intrinsic part of Western intellectual history is what is called the self-correcting tendency. Namely that, yes, we admit that what we thought about the Indians or the Afghans is incorrect. But we'll make amends. Now we'll write a better history. Okay? Now we'll be more attentive to the facts. Right? We'll look up our sources, we'll check our sources, we'll produce a better history. Now, I don't think that, by the way, that is what that will satisfy Edward Said. It certainly won't satisfy me. That this is not going to resolve the problem of Orientalism. Right? That's not going to resolve the problem of Orientalism, because that's simply an empiricist way of saying that, look, we all try to understand the other. In a very casual sense, you could say that, very casual sense, it's not going to help us, but let's begin with that very casual colloquial sense. Orientalism is a way of understanding the other. Right? Proposition number one. It's a way of understanding the other, or it purports to be a way, rather, of understanding the other. Right? It's not a way of, it doesn't purport to be a way of understanding oneself. It purports to be a way of understanding the other. Although, in fact, it may be the only way in which the West understood itself, was it had to create a radical difference between itself and something called the other. Okay, let me just finish with a train of thought, okay? That, in fact, Orientalism may have absolutely no relationship to something called the Orient. May have no relationship at all. And Ronald Ilden, in his piece, which is an elaboration with specific reference to India, okay, of what Edward Said is saying, he is very clear when he argues that this knowledge construct that he is giving you is not meant to suggest that there are actual facts about India that are going to be therefore revealed. It's not as though that once you knew what Orientalism was about, then you couldn't come to the conclusion that, well, now we are in a position to understand something called the real India. No. That is not, Orientalism is not designed to make you understand the critique of Orientalism is not designed to make you understand the real India as such. What Edward Said is doing. All right, so now I want to go through it systematically. I'm going to look at a couple of passages as well. And I'm going to suggest a few different ways in which you can tackle this whole question of Orientalism. Orientalism, very broadly, is about the politics of representation. Okay, who represents whom, with what authority, with what right, and with what consequences. Right? Who speaks for whom? Substitute that word for representation. There's this epitaph which appears in the beginning of Orientalism from Marx, okay, from the 18th Brumaire of Bonaparte. They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Right? That is, that whoever that they here is, in this case Indians now, for our purposes, they cannot speak for themselves. We are going to speak for them. And let me translate that into a much more colloquial expression in English. The Orientalists are telling the Indians, we know you better than you know yourself. We know you better. And that is one reason why you must accept Orientalist texts, because we understand and know you better than you know yourself. Okay? So Orientalism is not simply here, in this case, an entire apparatus, okay, for making the Orient understandable to the West. It may be that. If you want to put it that way, it's actually an entire intellectual apparatus for making the Orient understandable to the Orient itself, to the Orientals themselves. Right? That's the first proposition that we're looking at. And Edward Said says on page 2, okay, here he gives a definition. Orientalism is a style of thought based upon an ontological and epistemological distinction made between the Orient and most of the time something called the Occident. Right? Because obviously it assumes that there's a difference between the East and the West. The Orient is the East, the Occident is the West. All right? However, he's also very clear that we cannot simply say that what we are going to do when we have an understanding of Orientalism is come to an awareness of the real Orient. That's not the interest that either Said has or Ilden has or anybody else who has been looking at this particular theory. Page 1, line 6. The Orient was almost a European invention. That should make it very clear. It's not that we're interested in something called the real Orient here. Okay? The problem, therefore, is that when you are reading these British texts written about India, it's not the case that they're necessarily telling you anything about India at all. What they are telling you about is the intellectual milieu of the people who wrote those texts. What intellectual milieu they came from, what was their intellectual background, what were their epistemological assumptions about another society. That's what it's really telling you. Okay? Now let's look at some of the nitty-gritty problems that you come up with, and then I'll give you a full-fledged account getting into such things as discursive formation and tropes and so forth. Okay? If you look at Said's text, okay, it's very clear that Orientalism is an entire intellectual apparatus that comes into shape in the 18th century. And why the 18th century? That's a period of the Enlightenment, of course, right? it's also the period of colonialism. This is full-blown colonialism now. And he's looking, incidentally, here largely at the British and the French. I mean, you know that, of course, by the 18th century, the Portuguese have now become a minor power. The Spanish, obviously, are not as great a power as they used to be. There are other players as well. They're the Dutch, they're the Belgians. Germany is not unified at this point in time, so the Germans can't get into it. Of course, the minute German unification is achieved, the Germans will get into it and grab whatever little remains in the world. There's not very much that remains at that point in time. For example, German Southwest Africa. Right? So what he's talking about is in a sense that there's no real difference between these colonial powers. And I would really caution you about playing this game, which many scholars play, where they say, let's make a distinction between the good colonialists and the bad colonialists. No, there's really no such distinction. I mean, there are different styles of governance. There are different theories with which the British and the French and the Dutch governed their subjects. But colonialism is colonialism. We have to be very clear about that, right? And if somebody says that, well, you know, he doesn't really use enough examples from Spain, from Spanish colonialism and Portuguese and Dutch, that's really immaterial. Because what he's looking at are essentially the British and the French, who undoubtedly, by the second half of the 18th century, are the two major colonial powers. All right, and certainly going into the 19th century, unquestionably so. All right, so I just want to clear that. All right, now, here are some of the complications that you need to understand. First, if you get a question on your exam, what is Orientalism? And you write, Orientalism is a set of prejudices. No, that's not sufficient. Because we all have prejudices. Most of us won't admit to them, but we all have prejudices about the other. Right? Even the most enlightened person has tacit prejudices about the other. Okay? So it's not simply a set of prejudices, number one. Number two, not all prejudices are equally harmful. That might seem a strange way of putting it. Let me explain what I mean. White people have prejudices about black people, and black people have prejudices about white people. If somebody told me that black people don't have any prejudice about white people, I wouldn't be able to agree with that. I think they do. There's no question about it. However, the two are not equivalent. And the reason they're not equivalent is because the prejudices of white people have an institutional backing. They have a consequence for people who are not white. The prejudices of black people may not have the same consequences. And partly they don't have, so black people, you know, let's take a look, white men can't play basketball, they can't jump, you know, whatever, right? Something like that. I mean, there are even films that have been made with, you know, suggestive titles of that kind, as you know, right? Now you could say that that's a prejudice, right? But frankly, in the long run, it does not pack a punch. That is that if in the 18th century, white people have prejudices about Indians, they're lazy, they're deceitful, they're effeminate, there are no real men in that society, you know, etc., etc., etc. Right? I mean, I give you a whole list. We'll be here until midnight, okay? But those prejudices have consequences. Now, if a Hindu thinks, oh, this Englishman, he never takes a bath for a week, he stinks. Because, you know, it was not common taking a bath, by the way, in Europe. I hope you know that. I mean, the English learned to take a daily bath after they came to India, frankly. Okay? And that's one reason why they invented perfumes in Europe. You know, you just put a little bit perfume here and there, and you just hope it disguises all the bad smells. You know, it was not at all common in Europe for people to take a bath more than once a week. You know. Whereas in India, the habit of taking a daily bath has been there for as long as you can remember. And in fact, British texts themselves talk about it. So, you know, you could have a prejudice and say, you know, these people, they just stink to high heaven. You know, that's a prejudice now. Okay? But what effect does it have? Because who is governing whom? Who is governing whom? Right? So therefore, when you say, Orientalism is really a theory about the prejudices that a group of people have about another group of people, no, that is simply not sufficient. It is much more than that. Okay? Number one. Number two, there have always been people who have had what we might provisionally call Orientalist views about the other. For example, if you're a student of literature and you've ever read Dante, one of the great figures in Western literature, okay, so you read the Inferno, the Divine Comedy, and there are 3 parts to it, right? Okay, you know where the Prophet of Islam is consigned to? Has anybody here read Dante? No. Okay. The Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, is relegated to the lowest ring of hell in Dante. So somebody could say, well, Dante was extremely prejudicial about Muhammad and about Islam in general. No surprise here, frankly. I mean, who wasn't, that would be one way to look at it, that it's a problem when you look at European intellectual thought. It's seriously contaminated by racism across the board, frankly. Okay? But that's not exactly what we're talking about. It's not a matter of, well, Herodotus, maybe somebody here has read Herodotus, right? So Herodotus writes an account dates back to 2,500 years, and how he describes people in Asia who are half human, half animal. I'm just putting it to you in a nutshell, okay? People with the weirdest possible countenance and looks that you can imagine, okay? And so you could say, so would we be entitled to say, therefore, that Herodotus was an Orientalist and that Dante was an Orientalist? No, we would not. Because that's where prejudice comes in. That there are going to be innumerable examples of these kinds of prejudices. What Said is saying is something very different. What he's saying is that in the 18th century, and that is the heyday of colonialism, that's what you have to bear in mind. In the 18th century, a particular relationship developed between power and knowledge. There has always been a relationship between power and knowledge. In the 18th century, a very particular relationship developed between power and knowledge. Okay? And it developed under the conditions of colonialism, where an entire intellectual apparatus was created for representing the other. An entire intellectual apparatus and academic disciplines, organizations, entire societies were complicit in this enterprise. Okay? So this is a systematic way. It's not a matter of an individual here or there, Dante here or there having a prejudicial view about Islam or the Prophet, or Herodotus thinking, oh, people in India are really funny, because they look like this or that. That's not what we're talking about. What we're saying is that in the 18th century, Orientalism essentially comes into being in the 18th century. Orientalism becomes a systematic way of representing the other. And you cannot escape that any longer. This systematic institutional apparatus is all-encompassing. Okay? So that a certain interpretation acquires a certain kind of epistemic value. Okay, what Foucault, and this is where his name comes in, what Foucault would call an episteme, that a certain way of thinking, okay, now is not simply a matter of a prejudicial view here or there. It becomes an entire episteme about the other. Let me translate this into a different language for you and give you some examples. Okay, and I'll give you 2 very different kinds of examples, because these are different ways for you to understand what are the real substantive intellectual issues involved here. Because once you've got this cornered, essentially you'll be able to figure out what are some of the problems in these texts that you're reading. Okay, so the 2 different illustrations are of the following kind. And one has nothing to do with India. All right? There's a French writer, his name is Roland Barthes, and he writes a book. It's a fabulous book. I mean, it's fabulous because it's intellectually engaging. I don't agree with much of what he says. That's a different matter. And the book is called Empire of Signs. Okay? Empire of Signs. Now this book, has anybody here read the book? No. Okay. So this book is about Japan. It's a book about Japan. So it's got like 15, 20 short chapters. What are the chapters called? Okay? So chapters are going to be called samurai, kabuki. Okay? I hope you can see where I'm going with this now. Right? I mean, if he were writing the book today, he would have also probably had a chapter called Toyota or Nintendo. Okay? Right? Let's supposing you had to capture the essence of Japan. Somebody had used the word essence in a correction. Okay? Let's supposing you had to capture the essence of Japan. And I said to you, well, how would you capture the essence of Japan? You know? What are the things that immediately come to mind when I say the word Japan? You know? Okay? So instinctively you think, ramen, sushi. Think about it, right? I mean, what's going to come to mind is not democracy or literature. No, of course not. I mean, not that they don't have democracy or literature. But if I said to you, what instantly comes to mind when I say Japan? You say sushi, ramen, Toyota, Honda, Sony. Okay? If you knew a little bit more about Japan, you might say, kabuki. Okay? Right? Or no. No is, one form of Japanese performance art. Okay? Right? Right? So forth and so on. And if I said to you, okay, what instantly comes to mind? Instantly comes to mind when I say India. Mention 5 things to me. Huh? Sorry? Hinduism. Curry. Okay. And what else? Taj Mahal. I was waiting for that one. Taj Mahal. Absolutely. Right? Taj Mahal, if you're in the diaspora, samosa, perhaps, everywhere you go, there's a samosa there. Curry. Okay? Of course, in the 1930s, 1940s, the Hindu fakir, for example. Some people would say Gandhi. For example, Gandhi might instantly come to mind. Right? Now, what are we doing here? What we are saying is this. There is often a tendency to capture an entire civilization through its essences. And this becomes, for Roland Barthes, it's an empire of signs. You have to go somewhere. Right? I mean, before iPhone and all of this, right? I mean, what would you do? You'd follow the signs. 30 years ago, you're on the road. You have to go from here to Fargo, North Dakota. Don't ever go there. But if you had to go to Fargo, North Dakota, okay, well, what would you do? You'd follow the signs. Take the 101, 405, this or that, then do this, do that, etc., etc. That's what signs are. Why does he call it an empire of signs? That through these signs, so to speak, I'm creating an entire worldview about that civilization. Okay? And of course, it's full of hazards. Full of hazards. I mean, if you try to capture all of Japan through sushi and ramen and Sony and Nintendo, this and that. And similarly, if you try to capture all of India through the Taj Mahal and the samosa and Bollywood, right? I mean, if we spent another minute, I'm sure Bollywood would have come out immediately, right? Right? So forth and so on. Right? That would be the empire of science through which you would create an entire worldview about India. And so that's, of course, a certain form of reductionism. So one of the ways in which you can understand the critique of Orientalism is that it is a critique of highly reductionist accounts of Indian society. Now, this is where the second example comes in, because now we are on India. When I say a highly reductionist account of Indian society, what do I mean by that? Okay, this is where you come into the idea of a discursive formation. Foucault is going to argue that a certain dominant discourse creates a discursive formation. Okay, it's to be found in a book. His argument, scattered across his writings. But if you were interested, you could look at a book called The Archaeology of Knowledge. Okay, The Archaeology of Knowledge. The first 50 pages will give you a pretty good idea what he's really talking about. But you don't really need to know that, because the way I'm going to explain to you, that will be sufficient for your purposes, at least for this class. That a dominant discourse creates a certain kind of discursive formation. That is that there are certain elements to this discourse, okay, which give it coherence, internal coherence. It may not give it the coherence that its creators think they are giving it when they think that, it might give us a full view of the world. In this case of India, or the Orient, or Africa, or whatever the case might be. But from their point of view, it has a certain kind of internal consistency, this discursive formation. There are certain elements to this discursive formation. Now, what were some, not all, what were some of the elements of the discursive formation that came about as a consequence of British writings on India? Yes?
The caste system being this unchanging form of India, then sati, that like very small thing of women throwing themselves on female power.
Widow immolation, yeah.
So these types of women's rights,
yeah.
we have to go in and do that. So caste system becomes this.
Absolutely. You mentioned two, which are critical. Caste. Okay? If you want to explain the nature of Indian society, there's something called caste. Right? And if you know something about caste, according to this view, you're going to get a grip on Indian society. Okay? And the second element that she mentioned, there are many others, we're going to look at just 4 or 5 very briefly. The second element she mentioned is unchanging India. Timeless India. By the way, constantly replicated even today. This idea of a mystical India, which you find on television all the time, frankly. Okay? In India where things have always been going on forever. You can't really even put dates to things. Institutions, practices of certain kinds, certain rituals, they've been there since time immemorial. India doesn't fundamentally change. Now, you might say, what's a concrete illustration of that? Take a third trope and see its relationship to the second one. Third trope, Oriental Despotism. What is Oriental Despotism? Okay? Before we can answer that, I have to ask you, what is despotism? Anybody want to take a stab at it? What is despotism? Anything that comes to mind? How would you define it? Yes? A dictatorship. Okay. It's a dictatorship. So when Marx wrote about the dictatorship of the proletariat, remember in Communist Manifesto, he talks about what are the ends. We want a dictatorship of the proletariat. Did he have in mind despotism? No. I think colloquially speaking, you're right, that's a kind of a loose synonym. I want a little bit more precise definition. When you say dictatorship, yes, but the word dictatorship can be used in many different registers. Okay. Monarchy. So Britain is a monarchy today. Is it a despotism? Isn't Britain a monarchy? It is. Britain is a monarchy. Sweden is a monarchy, by the way, even today. These countries are all monarchies, actually. They might be constitutional monarchies, right, as opposed to the older kinds of monarchies that we might be thinking of. Some of these monarchs for life in Ivory Coast. Somebody appoints himself. I'm emperor forever. Right? I think that's what you really have in mind, actually, probably when you speak of monarchy or dictatorship. I want actually a precise kind of a definition. What does despotism mean as a form of government? It's a form of government. You might not like that form of government, but it's a form of government. Right? So, yes?
Isn't it generally a single all-powerful ruler?
Okay. Yeah, that's critical. Right? Because despotism comes from the word despot. Who's a despot? Somebody who exercises supreme, uncontradicted, unchecked power. Right? In a despotism, the life and property of no one is secure, because all life and property are hostage to the despot. That's what despotism is. Now, the British were convinced that India, before they came there, was an Oriental despotism. Okay? Oriental despotism. So what does that mean? Let's draw a pyramid here. Structure of Indian society. Okay? So for one thing, you have castes. Right? And caste is a system. Actually, it's not really a system of stratification as such, although colloquially you can speak of it as a system of stratification. One thing that is very clear is, in castes, you don't move up and down, according to the British view. Right? There's no mobility. It's fixed. You're born into a caste, that's your caste for life. Right? That's your caste for life. So this is how you would distinguish caste from class, because you may be born a pauper, but you may die a prince, so to speak. Or you may be born a prince and you may die a pauper. I'm using the phrase, the phrase from Mark Twain's famous story, The Prince and the Pauper. Right? But it's a rags to riches. So you may, today you may be really wealthy, and then, stock market crash 2008, and suddenly, the person who's got $10 million finds that, well, it's all worth nothing. Right? And they've got to sell their BMWs and Jaguars or whatever it is. Okay? So now they become lower class. That's mobility. It's not always upward mobility. It could be downward mobility too. Right? Caste, there's no mobility. In this view. I'm not giving you my assessment of what caste is or is not. I'm just telling you what this view is. Okay? So you've got a caste system in India, and this is what, according to the Orientalist view, makes India distinct. Right? Because that forms the basis of that society. The basis of that society. Now, the pyramid that we're talking about, we're not interested in the whole pyramid. We're interested in the Oriental despot. That's the OD. Okay? The Oriental despot who sits at the top. According to one dominant view of the nature of history in India. In fact, let me put it very dramatically. According to some British commentators, India had no history. India had no history, actually. What does that mean? What it means is partly that when history happens, so to speak, there's change, isn't there? Right? I mean, this phrase that is used in America all the time, it's used so often you would think that, we had nothing except history here. History in the making, Shaq O'Neal scores 60 points, that's history, that becomes history. Everything becomes history, the most trivial thing becomes history. Okay? That's a different problem, right? But what that means is change. There are things in flux, things are in process. According to some British commentators, there is no history in India at all. Why is there no history in India? Because all that happens is that the guy at the top, the Oriental despot, he enjoys life as long as he can before somebody else comes, usurps his power, and becomes the next Oriental despot. Change takes place at this apex over here. The rest of Indian society, the masses, the toiling peasants, they are going to go on with their life just as they have. It really makes not the slightest difference who's at the top to them. That may be one reason why British rule was able to survive in India so long, according to this view. That frankly, so long as most people said, well, I'm a peasant, I've got a pretty tough life, 10 hours I'm toiling in the hot sun, what do I really care whether the person who's ruling over me is white-skinned or brown-skinned? What do I really care? Right? You could say that was, and the British are going to say that is indeed the case. So frankly, they don't care. Now, I think we need much more complex narratives for understanding what is it that made it possible for the British to rule India for so long. But we're tabling that aside for the second because I'm on the subject of what I called a discursive formation. And we said, let's look at this discursive formation. Okay? What are these dominant ideas which become essences, by means of which all of India is going to be made comprehensible, understandable to the British? Right? Okay, and so we gave three elements of that. Caste, the caste system, unchanging India. Things never really change in India. Yeah, rulers come and go at the top, but the base of Indian society basically remains the same. Okay? And one of the reasons, of course, we haven't given all the reasons why things don't change in India. One of the reasons why they don't change is that India basically is a dreamland. It's a dreamland, right? So the opening quotation, let me read this is from Orientalist Constructions of India, the piece that you have, where he begins with a quotation from Hegel, from the Philosophy of History, where there's a whole section on India, right? And I'm going to just read this out and comment on it, and then we're going to end for today. Now it is the interest of spirit that external conditions should become internal ones, that the natural and the spiritual world should be recognized in the subjective aspect belonging to intelligence. Okay? By which process the unity of subjectivity, being generally, or the idealism of existence is established. Let me skip a few lines. Let me go to the end. Since, however, it is the abstract and absolute thought itself that enters into these dreams as their material, we may say that absolute being, right? So, if Hegel has this conception of the absolute being, the spirit, okay, is presented here meaning in India, as in the ecstatic state of a dreaming condition. A dreaming condition. Okay? By which he means, Hegel, that essentially, in the comprehension of India, it's as if we had to comprehend a dream. Okay? And that has many different consequences here. One of the consequences is that, I'm giving it to you in very colloquial terms. Okay? Very colloquial terms. One of the consequences is that, frankly, Indians do not really care about the material life. Now, you can see how this is going to become a justification for British rule. Hey, Indians, they're always immersed in philosophical thought. It's a dream-like existence. But, frankly, you need somebody to rule a country. We'll do it for them. Yeah, they're always lying in this vapor bath of a dream, so to speak. Okay? We, the British, we represent a hardy European stock. We value the material life. Right? This is going to become one of the ways in which, of course, the British are going to proceed when they're in India. So in my remarks to you on Thursday, I'm going to briefly continue with my discussion of Orientalism, just very briefly, because I think I've laid it out quite clearly. And then we're going to move immediately into the background of British presence in India. When they come to India, well, what's there? What is the nature of that history at that point in time?